Well, Nick, yeah, look, the worst thing for an athlete is to be injured, and it's really tough to get an injury right when you're in the middle of the circuit.
He smiles for the camera. Behind that smile, Carlos Alcaraz is terrified of one question. Can the wrist survive what's coming? On a Murcia court this week, his forehands looked flawless. A rebuilt wrist may feel strong in that gentle bubble. Then one tennis expert finally explains why the calm is a trap. That joint feels bulletproof right now. It stays that way until he faces a top 10 player who hits back with fury. Feel the cruelty of it. Everything looks healed. Nothing is proven. Late July has dragged his recovery into its most brutal stretch. The load finally climbs toward real match violence. Cincinnati opens August 13th, and his name sits on that list like a fragile promise. One haunting line keeps escaping his camp. No return until the wrist reads 100%. Now remember April, Barcelona. A small medical timeout swelled into a withdrawal that swallowed his whole clay season. The grass swing collapsed after it. Roland Garros crowned a stranger. Wimbledon slipped to a rival. From the #1 summit, he fell to third, watching it all from a couch. Love the tennis stories nobody dares tell? Subscribe now. The reason his wrist fails only against the elite is stranger than any injury report. That reason has almost nothing to do with pain. It lives in physics. A wrist rebuilding itself after a serious injury does not travel a straight line back toward trust. Healing arrives in layers, and the deepest layer stays hidden until force arrives that no friendly practice can ever produce. What the Murcia footage shows you is the surface. The surface always recovers first. Underneath it, the real question waits without an answer, and that gap between what looks fixed and what actually holds is the whole story an expert keeps trying to make people understand. Think about what a wrist truly does inside a tennis stroke. On a modern forehand, that small joint acts as the final accelerator, the last link in a chain that starts in the legs and uncoils through the hips, torso, shoulder, and forearm before releasing through the hand. Alcaraz built an entire identity on that release. His racket head speed ranks among the most violent on the planet, and the whip he generates comes largely from how aggressively his wrist snaps through contact. That same mechanism, so beautiful when healthy, becomes a liability the instant the joint carries any doubt. A player cannot fake the snap. He either commits fully or he pulls back a fraction, and a fraction is all it takes for the entire shot to change character. Now separate two worlds that outsiders wrongly treat as one. Practice hitting and match combat share a court, a net, and a ball, yet they demand completely different things from a wrist. During a controlled session, a coach or a hitting partner feeds the ball at a rhythm the recovering player can predict. The bounce lands where it should, the pace stays inside a comfortable band. Nothing forces the arm into a rushed, ugly, off-balance swing. Everything cooperates, and cooperation is precisely what disguises weakness. A joint asked only to perform in ideal conditions will happily report that it feels strong because the conditions never ask it to prove otherwise. An elite opponent destroys those conditions on purpose. A top 10 player does not feed the ball. He attacks it, bends it, accelerates it, and drags his rival into positions the body did not choose. The difference shows up in raw numbers first. A heavy hitter can push a ground stroke through the court at a speed that gives the receiver a sliver of a second less to prepare, and that missing sliver forces the wrist to stabilize under load while the arm is still moving, still adjusting, still fighting for balance. Multiply that by hundreds of exchanges, then add the fatigue that thickens across a 2 or 3 hour battle, and you begin to see why a session in Murcia proves so little about a match in New York. The return of serve exposes the flaw more brutally than any other shot. When a rival launches a delivery beyond 200 kilometers an hour, the returner has no time to build a stroke from the ground up. He must meet violence with a short, sudden block, absorbing pace he never created and redirecting it through a joint that is bracing rather than swinging. That absorption is where recovering wrists tend to break down, because the load hits eccentrically, forcing the tissue to decelerate a fast ball instead of accelerating a slow one. A cooperative practice partner rarely serves with genuine intent to hurt. A top 10 server does nothing else, and the wrist meets that intent cold, without the gradual buildup a rehab plan so carefully provides. His own serve poses a threat that rivals anything an opponent can throw back. At the peak of the motion, the racket snaps through contact on the strength of a violent pronation, and the dominant wrist governs that final flick more than any other part of the arm. The injured joint happens to be the right one, the very wrist that drives his delivery, which means the serve cannot simply be shielded the way a player might protect a backhand by running around it. Every first serve demands the full explosive extension the injury targeted, and a match asks for that motion more than 100 times across a handful of hours. A cautious wrist robs the serve of speed and bite, handing opponents shorter, softer deliveries to attack, and the entire foundation of a hard-court game begins to crumble from there. Here sits the counterintuitive truth an expert has been circling. Strength under low demand tells you nothing reliable about strength under peak demand, and a wrist is the cruelest example of that rule in all of sport. The joint tolerates repetitive, moderate stress beautifully. Spike the stress, especially the sudden torque of decelerating a fast, spinning ball, and the tissue that felt secure a moment earlier can flare, stiffen, or simply refuse to fire with full trust. That flare rarely announces itself in a friendly rally. It waits for the moment when a rival stretches Alcaraz wide, jams him at the body, or forces him to redirect pace he did not generate. In that instant, the wrist meets a demand no rehab session dared replicate. The surface he chose for his return sharpens the danger into something almost ironic. Clay absorbs shock, slows the ball, and gives a joint the extra split second that softens every impact. Grass rewards touch and shortens rallies, which limits the grinding repetition that punishes a fragile wrist. Alcaraz sat out both of those forgiving surfaces during his absence, skipping the entire clay and grass calendar while he healed. His comeback now lands on hard court, the least merciful ground in tennis, where the ball skids through faster and every bounce transmits a jarring pulse up the arm. He avoided the surfaces that would have coddled the joint and aimed his return at the one that tests it hardest, a choice dictated by the calendar rather than by anything kind to a recovering wrist. The finesse that defines his genius depends on the same fragile joint, and finesse dies quietly long before power does. Alcaraz owns one of the most devastating drop shots in the sport, a disguised touch that relies on feather-light control at the exact instant of contact. That control comes from a relaxed, precise wrist, the polar opposite of a joint that flinches or tenses in self-defense. A player guarding an injury loses the delicate feel first because subtlety cannot survive hesitation. He might still bludgeon a forehand through fear, yet the caress of a perfect drop shot requires a trust the wrist may no longer grant. Strip that weapon from his arsenal and the top opponents adjust instantly, camping deeper, daring him to find a magic he can no longer summon. Consider what has actually been happening away from the cameras. Alcaraz has not struck a competitive ball since April, when a wrist problem surfaced during his opening match at the Barcelona Open against Otto Virtanen. He won that match in straight sets, took a medical timeout for his arm late in the first set, then withdrew from the tournament the following day, rather than risk the round of 16. Months of near-total silence followed. His team guided him through a slow, deliberate rebuild that resembled a second preseason, dropped into the middle of summer, beginning with cardiovascular work and strength before any racket entered the picture. The gentle forehands the world eventually saw were not proof of recovery. Those were the first careful rungs of a very tall ladder. His dedication to the process bordered on obsession, which tells you how frightened the camp truly was of a setback. During a summer break in Italy, cameras caught him performing wrist exercises alongside his physiotherapist on a yacht, refusing to let a holiday interrupt the rehabilitation. A player relaxing on the water would normally set the work aside for a few days. He could not or would not, and that refusal reveals a mind consumed by the fear that any lost hour might cost him the joint entirely. The image looked charming on social media. Beneath the charm sat a warning about how precarious the situation remained, even in a moment meant for rest. The phase unfolding across late July changes the meaning of everything. After months of controlled, low-intensity hitting, the plan finally calls for the load to climb toward genuine match pressure. Reports out of Spain describe this as the decisive stretch, the window that will determine whether a comeback is real or premature. Everything before it happened inside the safe band. Everything that matters happens now, as the intensity rises and the joint gets asked, for the first time since spring, to behave the way tournament tennis actually requires. This is the exact moment the expert warns about, because this is where a wrist stops performing for the camera and starts answering the only question that counts. Match rhythm sits at the heart of what he cannot rebuild in a lab. A player can recover strength, mobility, and even confidence in a practice bubble, yet the specific timing of live competition only returns through live competition. The instinct to read an opponent's pace, to load the legs a fraction earlier, to trust the arm when a ball arrives heavier than expected, all of it decays during a long layoff and refuses to reappear on command. Alcaraz has lost 4 months of that timing, and no amount of controlled hitting restores it. He can only regain it by playing, which means the wrist and the rhythm must both come back at once, under fire against opponents who will not wait for either to settle. Even the finest sparring partner cannot bridge that divide, and the reason cuts to the core of the expert's argument. A hitting partner, however talented, works with the recovering player rather than against him, grooving rallies and offering readable pace so the session builds confidence instead of chaos. A genuine top 10 opponent brings the opposite intention entirely, disguising shots, changing rhythm without warning, and hunting for the exact weakness a rehabbing athlete is trying to hide. No practice environment can manufacture that hostility, because the whole purpose of practice is to control the variables that a match deliberately unleashes. The joint that survives 1,000 cooperative forehands has still never met an opponent determined to break it, and that untested meeting is the only measurement that will ever matter. The team has repeated a single condition through every update, and the phrasing rarely softens. No return until the wrist reads 100%. That line sounds reassuring on the surface, yet it quietly admits the danger. A camp confident in a full recovery does not need to keep insisting on a full recovery. The repetition signals how delicate the situation remains, and how aware everyone around him is that a rushed comeback could undo months of patient work in a single reckless afternoon. Caution of that intensity usually reflects a fear that outsiders never fully see. Cincinnati is where the theory collides with reality. The Masters event begins on August 13th, and Alcaraz sits on the entry list as the defending champion, a title he claimed last year when Jannik Sinner retired from the final while unwell. His name on that list reads like hope to supporters and like a gamble to anyone who understands the load problem. A comeback there hands him almost no runway. He would arrive without a single competitive match in 4 months, and the draw could place a dangerous, top-tier ball striker in front of him within days. There would be no gentle reintroduction, no cooperative feeder, no chance to test the joint against soft pace before the real thing. The tournament would slam the wrist straight into elite demand, which is the precise scenario the expert keeps identifying as the true test. The specific faces waiting in that draw make the warning concrete. The current elite is stacked with exactly the kind of hitters most likely to expose a compromised joint. Sinner, the man who stripped him of the #1 ranking and now leads the sport, strikes the ball with a flat, relentless depth that grants opponents no rest. Younger power merchants like Ben Shelton unleash serves and forehands built to overwhelm. Veterans such as Daniil Medvedev and Novak Djokovic redirect pace with a precision that drags rivals into long, punishing exchanges. Anyone of them met on day one of a comeback would ask the wrist a question it has not faced since spring, and the answer would arrive in public at full speed with no chance to hide. Notice what he chose to skip along the way. The Canadian Open in Montreal, an event that would have offered exactly the kind of tune-up a returning player craves, never appeared on his schedule. His name stayed off that entry list while it landed on Cincinnati's, and the decision reveals the tightrope his team is walking. They want him competitive for the hard court swing, yet they refuse to expose the wrist a day earlier than the rehab timeline allows. The result is a plan with almost zero margin, one that could send him into a Masters draw cold, trusting a joint that has never been stress-tested against anyone trying to hurt him. The ranking adds a second layer of pressure that has nothing to do with health and everything to do with consequence. Alcaraz began the season at the summit, then surrendered the top position to Sinner after losing the Monte Carlo final in April. His long absence pushed him further down, and he now sits at world number 3 with a points total drained by every tournament he could not enter. He is defending roughly 3,000 points across the hard-court stretch, the combined reward from winning both Cincinnati and the US Open a year ago. Should the wrist fail him, or should caution keep him sidelined, those points evaporate, and a player who held number 1 just months ago could slide even further from the peak he spent years chasing. The gap to Sinner has become its own quiet emergency. While Alcaraz sat idle, his greatest rival kept winning, capturing titles and stacking points that widened the distance between them at the top of the game. A rivalry that felt like a coin flip in January now tilts heavily toward the Italian, and every week Alcaraz misses lets that advantage harden. The most punishing irony is that closing the gap requires beating exactly the caliber of opponent his wrist is least ready to face. He cannot climb back by hitting forehands in Murcia. He can only climb back by defeating elite players in real matches, which forces the joint into the very test the expert flags as most dangerous. Contrast that with how the year began, because the contrast sharpens the stakes. In January, Alcaraz lifted the Australian Open trophy and completed the career Grand Slam at 22, becoming the youngest man ever to hold all 4 major titles. He added a title in Doha soon after and looked, for a stretch, like the defining force of the sport. The fall from that height to a rehab court in Murcia happened with brutal speed, and the wrist sits at the center of the collapse. A joint that once delivered the most electric forehand in tennis became the single thing standing between him and everything he had built. His absence hollowed out more than a ranking because the sport itself lost one of its biggest attractions. Analysts have described the Spaniard as a rare needle mover, a player whose mere presence changes the atmosphere and the economics of an event, filling seats and lifting broadcasts in a way few athletes manage. Every tournament he missed felt diminished, and the tour spent months waiting for its most magnetic figure to reappear. That commercial wait adds a subtle pressure of its own, because a returning superstar carries the expectations of promoters, sponsors, and fans who all want the show back, whether or not the wrist is truly ready to deliver it. The expert community itself cannot agree, and the disagreement tells you how little anyone truly knows. Boris Becker studied the early footage and offered an encouraging read, suggesting the movement looked promising for a player in the opening stages of recovery. Other former professionals landed nowhere near that optimism. Voices such as Mark Philippoussis and Richard Krajicek expressed open uncertainty, pointing to the scarcity of concrete information about the actual extent of the damage and to the stubborn difficulty of fully rehabilitating a wrist. That split matters. When accomplished former players cannot reach a shared verdict from the same evidence, it usually means the evidence is thin, guarded, and open to wildly different interpretations, which is exactly the fog surrounding this comeback. The information vacuum deserves its own attention. Alcaraz and his team have never disclosed the precise nature of the injury in detail. The public has received vague references to a wrist problem, careful footage of light hitting, and a steady drip of cautious optimism, yet nothing that resembles a full medical picture. That silence is not unusual for a top athlete protecting a competitive edge, but it leaves fans and analysts guessing, filling the gap with hope or dread depending on their temperament. The expert argument thrives inside that uncertainty, because a hidden diagnosis makes the load test even more important. Without a clear medical answer, the only honest verdict comes from watching how the joint behaves under real pressure, and that verdict has not yet been delivered. Psychology tightens the trap further. A wrist injury does not only wound tissue, it plants hesitation, and hesitation ruins timing in a sport measured in fractions of a second. A player returning from this kind of setback often protects the joint without consciously deciding to, easing off the snap, shortening the swing, guarding against a pain that may not even arrive. Against a weak opponent, that caution costs almost nothing. Against a top-10 striker who punishes every soft ball, the caution becomes fatal to the point. The mind and the joint feed each other, and the loop only breaks when a player trusts the wrist completely, which no rehab session can manufacture. Trust of that kind gets earned in combat, and combat is the one thing Alcaraz has avoided for months. History supplies a warning that the sport has not forgotten. Juan Martín del Potro owned one of the most fearsome forehands the game ever produced, and wrist injuries dismantled his career in slow, agonizing waves, dragging him through repeated surgeries and long absences that eventually stole his prime. Nobody suggests Alcaraz faces that exact fate, yet the parallel haunts every cautious decision his team makes. They watched what a mishandled wrist did to a generational talent, and the memory explains why they refuse to rush. A single premature return, one aggressive match too soon, can transform a recoverable injury into a chronic one, and the difference often reveals itself only under the very load the expert keeps highlighting. Strip away the noise, and the entire situation reduces to one unresolved experiment. Everyone can see that the wrist feels strong in a protected environment. Nobody has seen how it responds when a genuine top-10 opponent turns a rally into a war. The gap between those two states is where the danger lives, and it is the gap the title promises to explain. A controlled forehand in Murcia answers a small question. A defensive stab at full stretch against a player hammering the ball into the corners answers the enormous one, and that answer stays sealed until the moment he actually steps onto a match court against someone capable of forcing it. The US Open magnifies every thread of this into its final, unavoidable form. The tournament opens on August 30th, and Alcaraz arrives as the defending champion, carrying the weight of a title he must protect while nursing a joint nobody has fully verified. Should he skip Cincinnati or exit early, he could walk into a Grand Slam without a single competitive match behind him, asking a rebuilt wrist to survive best-of-5 sets against the deepest field in the sport. Best of 5 changes the equation entirely. The extra hours, the extra rallies, the extra fatigue all stack the load higher than any other stage in tennis, and they arrive precisely when the joint is least prepared to meet them. The expert reasoning does not merely apply to that scenario, it practically predicts it. The cruelest trick of wrist rehabilitation is the false dawn, and it explains why feeling wonderful can be the most dangerous stage of all. A joint often reaches a plateau where the pain vanishes and the movement flows, convincing the athlete that the ordeal has ended. That plateau seduces a competitor into pushing harder, testing more, believing fully, right at the point when the underlying tissue has not yet earned that belief. The relapse, when it comes, tends to strike during that surge of misplaced confidence, undoing weeks of progress in a single overzealous session. Alcaraz has almost certainly reached that seductive plateau, which is exactly why his team keeps preaching restraint. The good feeling is real. The temptation it creates is the threat, and a top opponent supplies the perfect trap for a player who has started to believe too soon. Weigh the two outcomes that now hang over him. In the hopeful version, the wrist holds, the snap returns, and the player who completed the career Grand Slam in January reclaims his place among the men fighting for the biggest titles. In the darker version, the joint feels wonderful right up to the moment a top opponent tests it, then falters in real time on the sport's largest stage, exposing a weakness that months of careful footage never revealed. Both versions begin from the same starting point, the same reassuring practice clips, the same optimistic camp. Only the arrival of elite pressure separates them, and that pressure is coming whether the timeline is ready or not. So the calm you feel watching him hit is real, and it is also incomplete. The forehands look clean because clean is what protected practice produces. The confidence around him builds because confidence is easy when nothing has been tested. The joint reports strength because strength under low demand is the easiest report a wrist can give. Every piece of the reassurance is genuine, and every piece of it stops mattering the instant a top 10 player steps across the net and refuses to cooperate. That is the fault line the expert keeps tracing, and it is the fault line the coming weeks will finally expose. Watch closely as the intensity climbs because the truth will surface without warning. A single grimace during a hard exchange, a fraction of hesitation on a stretch forehand, a serve that loses its snap under fatigue, any of these could reveal in a heartbeat what months of guarded footage refused to show. Or the wrist could hold, silence the doubters, and turn this entire warning into a footnote. Nobody knows yet, and that uncertainty is the whole point. The answer belongs to the court, and the court has not spoken. If breakdowns like this are the reason you love tennis beyond the highlights, do one thing before you leave. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the moment Alcaraz steps back onto a match court, the verdict on that wrist arrives here first. Dissected the way the mainstream coverage never dares. Stay with us and you will see the truth the instant it reveals itself.